10 years ago, Cyril Ramaphosa told South Africa that attacking foreigners does not just hurt the victims, it destroys the soul of the nation. He warned that when South Africans dehumanise foreign nationals, South Africans also dehumanise themselves. 6 years ago, as president, he warned again that people must not take the law into their own hands. Now in 2026, with new anti-migrant marches, repatriations, renewed attacks, and the June 30th deadline promoted by anti-immigrant groups for undocumented foreigners to leave, Ramaphosa is saying something even stronger. Immigration enforcement belongs to the state, and the state alone. So here is the uncomfortable question. If the warning has been the same for 10 years, why does the crisis keep coming back? Welcome to the South Africa File. This is where we follow the history, the power, the politics, and the consequences. Today, we are looking at Ramaphosa's own words across three moments: 2015, 2019, and 2026. Not to praise him, and not simply to attack him, but to ask what these repeated warnings reveal about the South African state, xenophobia, and the failure to turn strong speeches into working institutions. Let's begin 10 years ago. Take a listen of an excerpt of his 2016 speech about the situation.
It is not acceptable that any one of us as South Africans can go out and attack people from other countries because they come from other countries. It cannot be acceptable. It dehumanizes us as South Africans. As we seek to dehumanize them, we are dehumanizing ourselves.
In 2015, Ramaphosa was still deputy president. South Africa was again facing xenophobic violence, and he reached for the deepest language of the post-apartheid promise. He spoke about the Freedom Charter, peace, human rights, Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and the idea that South Africa should be a country where everyone's dignity is protected. But beneath all of that, his argument was simple. These attacks betray the promises made during the struggle for freedom. What stands out from that 2015 message is the language of shame. Ramaphosa was not only saying that xenophobic attacks are illegal, he was saying they betray the very idea of democratic South Africa. And his point was direct. If South Africans attack people because they come from other countries, they are not only violating the rights of migrants, they are damaging the humanity of South Africa itself. That matters because xenophobia is not just violence against the other. It is also a mirror. It shows what a society becomes when pain turns into hatred, and when people who were once oppressed begin to treat other vulnerable people as disposable. But here is the problem. A moral warning can expose a crisis, but it cannot stop the crisis by itself. After 2015, South Africa still did not build a strong enough prevention system. Communities remained angry, Home Affairs remained mistrusted, police response remained inconsistent, local government remained weak, and migrants remained vulnerable in the places where fear could be turned into violence. The speeches were getting better, but the reality on the ground was getting worse. And that is why, by 2019, Ramaphosa was no longer speaking only as deputy president. He was now president, and the warning had shifted. This time, the core message was not only about dignity, it was about law. Let's take a listen.
But South Africans are not xenophobic. South Africans are not against nationals from other countries. We welcome people from other countries, and we are going to work very hard that we encourage and promote social cohesion of all the people of South Africa, working and living side by side with people from other parts of our continent. This this.
Yes, you heard him. The key line from that 2019 message was clear. Do not take the law into your own hands. That tells us something important. By 2019, the threat was not only hatred of foreigners. It was mob enforcement. It was the idea that ordinary people could decide who belongs, who must leave, whose shop must close, whose documents must be checked, and whose body can be threatened in the name of protecting South Africans. This is where xenophobia becomes more than prejudice. It becomes a challenge to the state, because once crowds begin enforcing immigration in the streets, the question is no longer only whether migrants are safe. The question becomes whether the rule of law is still in charge. Ramaphosa seemed to understand that. He said South Africa is home to people from other nations, that problems and challenges must be addressed. He acknowledged that criminality can involve foreigners and South Africans alike. However, he drew a line. Those problems cannot justify people taking the law into their own hands. That should have been the turning point. But again, the warning did not become a strong enough system. And there is another uncomfortable truth here. The state is not just a neutral referee watching xenophobia rise from outside. South Africa's political system has often helped create the very atmosphere it now claims to be fighting. Some politicians speak the language of constitutional values in one moment, then echo anti-migrant panic in another. Some local officials condemn violence publicly, but quietly allow foreign nationals to become the easiest explanation for failed services, overcrowded clinics, unemployment, crime, and municipal collapse. That is the good cop and bad cop reality of South African politics. At the top, there are speeches about peace, law, dignity, and African unity. On the ground, there are political actors who know that blaming migrants can deflect anger away from their own failures. So when we talk about state failure, we are not only talking about weak systems. We are also talking about political convenience. Migrants become useful because they absorb anger that should be moving toward the people who govern. And now we arrive in 2026. The crisis has returned, but with new intensity. Anti-migrant groups are marching. June 30th has become a date of fear because some anti-immigrant groups promoted it as a deadline for undocumented foreigners to leave. Migrants are hiding, fleeing, or registering for repatriation. African governments are watching. South Africa's image on the continent is taking damage. And now, Ramaphosa's language has changed again. This time, he does something very important. He does not only condemn xenophobia, he admits state failure. He says there have been weaknesses in migration management, weaknesses in enforcement, weaknesses linked to corruption, and gaps in the system that have undermined public confidence. Then he draws the clearest line yet. Only authorized government officials may act against violations of the law, including immigration law. No private person may confront someone in the street and demand proof of identity. No group may exploit legitimate concerns to destabilize the country through lawlessness and violence. Let's take a listen.
Huge challenge. The challenge of a number of our people who are taking the law into their own hands, much as they have certain grievances. And I've said that taking action against people from other nations is not justified and should never be allowed in our beautiful country. South Africa is a home for all.
This is the most revealing excerpt of the three speeches. In 2015, Ramaphosa spoke like a constitutional moralist. He appealed to South Africa's values. In 2019, he spoke like a president warning against mob justice. He appealed to the rule of law. In 2026, he speaks like a president whose state is trying to take back authority from the street. That is the shift. And this is why the moment is so serious. When the president has to remind the country that only the state can enforce immigration law, It means non-state actors have already begun acting as if they have that power. When he has to say, no one may confront people in the streets demanding proof of identity, it means that kind of confrontation has become politically visible. When he says groups are exploiting legitimate concerns for political, personal, and criminal agendas, he is admitting that the anger of ordinary South Africans is being used by other forces. But we must go one step further. Those forces do not grow in a vacuum. They grow when the state fails to enforce the law fairly, when communities do not trust home affairs, when policing is weak. They grow when local government collapses, when public services fail, and when political parties discover that migration can be used as a shortcut for votes, attention, and anger. That takes us back to the argument we made in the first episode, which is that South Africans are angry for real reasons. Unemployment is real. Crime is real. Corruption is real. Public services are failing. Many people feel abandoned. However, real anger can still be redirected toward the wrong enemy. The deeper failure is that the state allowed a vacuum to form, and parts of the political system helped fill that vacuum with migrant blame. When institutions lose credibility, vigilante movements step in and say, "We will do what the state failed to do." That message is dangerous because it sounds decisive. It makes people feel protected. It gives frustrated communities a visible target. But it also replaces law with fear. And once fear becomes a method of politics, migrants are only the first target. Tomorrow, the same logic can be used against anyone labelled undesirable. That is why Ramaphosa's 2026 speech matters. But it also raises a harder question. Why did it take this level of panic, repatriation, diplomatic pressure, and public fear for the state to draw the line so clearly? The truth is that South Africa does not suffer from a shortage of anti-xenophobia speeches. It has had those speeches for years. The country suffers from a failure to turn those speeches into credible institutions, trusted enforcement, and protection for vulnerable people. That is why the same crisis keeps returning. Moral condemnation is not enough if police do not act early. Presidential speeches are not enough if local leaders spread fear. Migration policy is not enough if corruption allows the system to fail. Saying South Africans are not xenophobic is not enough if migrants are hiding in fear. And sending diplomatic envoys is not enough if the streets continue to send a different message. So the real story across these three Ramaphosa speeches is not simply that he has been consistent. In many ways, he has been. He has condemned xenophobia, defended peaceful coexistence, and warned against mob justice. The real story is that the crisis has evolved while the state has remained too reactive, and while sections of the political system have continued to benefit from migrant blame. In 2015, the warning was moral. In 2019, the warning was legal. In 2026, the warning is institutional. The state must reclaim its authority before vigilante politics becomes normal. That is the danger before June 30th. Not only that something may happen on one date, but that fear itself becomes accepted as policy, rumours become enforcement, and street pressure becomes negotiation. That groups learn they can force the state to respond by creating panic. And if that lesson takes hold, the country will face this again. Maybe under another name, maybe with another movement, maybe with another deadline. But the script will remain the same. Crisis becomes blame, blame becomes mobilization, mobilization becomes fear, fear becomes violence, and then come speeches, condemnations, and promises until the next round begins. So here is the question South Africa must face honestly. After 10 years of warnings, does the state only know how to condemn xenophobia, or is it finally ready to prevent it? Because if a president has to say the same thing in 2015, again in 2019 and again in 2026, then the real question is no longer whether South Africa knows xenophobia is wrong. The real question is why the state keeps failing to stop the conditions that make xenophobia politically useful. This is the South Africa File. History, power, politics, and consequences. Before you go, I want to ask you two questions. First, do you think Ramaphosa's latest warning will make a real difference this time? Yes or no? And second, what should South Africa do to restore immigration enforcement to the law without allowing vigilante groups to control the streets? Put your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation serious, honest, and grounded in evidence.